Phil Hawes is the biggest what if in UFC history.
So the word coming out of Jackson's camp is this kid Hawes is the real deal. They're saying that this is gonna be the next big superstar. Apparently they're comparing him to like Chris Weidman and John Jones. So obviously I'm excited for this fight.
I'll say he's one of the toughest opponents I've ever had in the ring or at practice. I mean, he's that good. He always have been able to give me my money. Phil has a tremendous amount of potential to be a world champion one day. He's just a sponge. He's a sponge for knowledge, and you know, he's destined to be at the top.
It's awesome to get a contract, but I don't want to get too excited. I came in this sport to be a world champion. That's what I'm looking to do.
At one point, Phil was seen to be the next John Jones, but after losing 3 straight times, all via first-round knockout in his last 3 fights with UFC, he was cut from the company, and a once highly touted prospect completely fell off the face of the earth.
Game opponent Phil Hawes, who obviously, as we can see, is devastated from this loss.
But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also, if you guys are enjoying the content and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, alongside with other perks as well. But anyways, let's get into it. When Phil Hawes originally made it to the UFC, he was seen as a guy that had all the potential in the world. And when you look back and watch some of his performances early on in his UFC career, you can certainly see why. As he was able to beat guys like Kyle Daukaus, Deron Winn, and most importantly, Nassourdine Imavov. But even in the fights that Phil Hawes was losing, he was still winning those fights until he wasn't. If you look back to his Ikram Aliskerov fight, his Roman Dolidze fight, his Chris Curtis fight, all 3 of those losses are examples of fights that Phil Hawes was doing the better work in until he wasn't. So a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why was Phil Hawes able to have so much success in a lot of his different fights, and why was he perceived to be a guy that had all the potential in the world and the next John Jones? Well, in my opinion, I think this comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is his wrestling. Because originally when Phil came into the UFC and started his MMA journey, he was mostly known to be a very talented wrestler. He had a great and very powerful double leg, and on the ground, Phil was doing a great job at not only holding position, but also landing big ground and pound shots, finding finishes on the ground as well. So clearly Phil Hawes' wrestling game was a huge part of why he was so successful on his MMA come up. But the great thing about Phil Hawes is he didn't just stop there. He wasn't only known to be a wrestler out there. He also did a great job at working on a striking game, specifically his Muay Thai, and by the end of his MMA career, he turned into a very talented and a very capable striker. As on the feet, Phil Hawes does a couple of different things really well. And the first thing that he does really well is utilize his jab. In a lot of his different fights, you can see Phil Hawes constantly throwing out that jab to the head as well as to the body. And basically what he's trying to do at that point is feel out his range and feel out his distance. And once Phil is able to get a read of his distance by utilizing that jab, that's really where Phil Hawes starts to go to work. As at that point, he does a great job at throwing leg kicks, body kicks, as well as that big right hand. And when you look back at a lot of the matchups that Phil Hawes has either won or even lost, you really saw that. Early on, he would utilize his jab, and once he finds his range and once he finds his distance, that's really where he starts to go to work. As when you look back in the Chris Curtis fight, he was piecing up Chris Curtis for the most part of that matchup. If you look back at his Deron Winn fight, he was piecing up Deron Winn for the entirety of the fight, and all of that damage and all of that volume was all predicated based off of his jab. But the last reason for Phil Hawes' success is due to his physicality. Now, I talk about this in a lot of my videos, but guys that have great physicality are usually more successful in the UFC. And a reason for why that is because they can be losing a majority of the fight, but it takes one big right hand or one big shot to knock out their opponents. And although Phil Hawes was missing one aspect of his physicality, and that is his chin, at the same time he did have insanely good power. And when you look back at a lot of his fights, that power right hand or those power elbows that he was able to throw really had big effects on a lot of his opponents. And I do believe because of that power, alongside with his striking acumen, alongside with his wrestling acumen, was was a huge reason for why Phil Hawes was perceived to be a very talented prospect and a guy that had all the talent and potential in the world. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, due to the fact that he had all the skill and potential and power in the world, what went wrong for Phil Hawes? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to one factor and one factor only, and that's his chin. Because in terms of all the other skills that make a fighter really successful and really talented, Phil Hawes had all of that. He had the striking, he had the wrestling, he had the power. It seemed like he had it all. But when you look back at a lot of the fights that Phil Hawes was in, you could really start to see a pattern, and you could really start to see the reason for why he wasn't as successful as he should have been, and that was because of his chin. If you look back at his fights against Ikram Aliskerov, Roman Dolidze, and especially Chris Curtis, in all 3 of those fights he ended up losing via a first round TKO. But also in all 3 of those fights, Phil Hawes was winning the fights. He was piecing up his opponents, especially in the Chris Curtis fight, as he was doing a great job at landing leg kicks, body kicks, right hands up top, jabs. He was really doing a great job at implementing his game plan on all 3 of those opponents. But no matter how well Phil Hawes was doing in the individual fights, and no matter how much success he was having in those fights, it really didn't matter, because eventually all 3 of those opponents landed one big shot. Whether it was a left or right hand, it didn't really matter, and Phil Hawes from then was hurt significantly and put out cold in a lot of his performances. So it became increasingly obvious as Phil Hawes' career started to progress, and of course as he was cut by the UFC, that Phil Hawes was an extremely talented fighter. He was never in a fight where he was completely outmatched, and in fact he was actually winning the majority of the fights that he was ever in. And it's not like he never went up against a fighter that was high level or high caliber. As I did say, he did have a win over Nasruddin Imavov. So unfortunately for Phil Hawes, regardless of all the skill that he did have, and regardless of how diverse he was both on the feet as well as on the ground, at the end of the day he just had no chin. And obviously you're at a significant disadvantage at that point if you can be winning the majority of your fights, but if your opponents land one big shot, you completely go out from there. Now obviously on top of his chin issues, he also had a propensity to take big shots, which obviously didn't help as well. So regardless of all the talent, the reason for why Phil Hawes never turned into a great fighter in the UFC is due to his chin and due to his propensity to taking big shots. Well, a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I think Phil Hawes will ever make it back to the UFC, as he's not all that old at this point? Well, in my opinion, the answer to that question is no, because as good as Phil Hawes may have been at one point, at this point as of late in the recent performances that we've seen him in, he looks a little bit slower, he doesn't look as confident and on the feet, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact that he's been knocked out so many times. And in his most recent performance in Dirty Boxing, he ended up taking big shots in that fight, getting hurt pretty significantly, and although he did make it to the scorecards, at the end of the day, he was still running into the same issues that he seemingly falls into in every fight, while also at the same time he ended up losing that fight in Dirty Boxing. So at this point, not only do I think Phil Hawes will never get re-signed by the UFC, but I don't think there's a super high likelihood that he ever fights MMA in general, as I do think he'll run into the same issues regardless of the level of opponent that he goes up against. He's obviously UFC caliber in terms of the skill that he does have, but at this point it just seems like he's going to take a big shot eventually in a fight, whether it's 3 rounds or whether it's 5 rounds, and because of that, I don't think there's going to be a lot of MMA organizations out there that are looking to sign this guy, and maybe even from Phil Hawes' perspective himself, he may want to consider retirement based upon all the damage that he's been taking over the years and the amount of times that he's been knocked out cold. Obviously that's not good for you, and when you look at Phil Hawes, he's been knocked out cold countless times. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Phil Hawes could have been a legitimate contender and a potential champion in the UFC, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.